What is going on, Pro EDU community? It's Dustin Falkema, and in today's video, we're going to be talking about Photoshop overlays and one of the fastest ways that you can add a lot of detail and depth to your images very quickly without having to manually hand paint a lot of effects in. Now, we have a lot of packs on proedu.com that are the exact overlays that I use in a lot of my cosplay photography work, and today we're going to show you exactly how to use those in various ways of manipulating them. Now, this isn't going to be a step-by-step tutorial on how to create great images, rather a bit more of just insight on how to use these overlays, what blend modes to use, different ways that you can manipulate them, and certain things to look out for along the way. So let's go ahead and dive into Photoshop and take a look. Alright, here we are in Photoshop taking a look at this awesome Jedi cosplay image from Scott Hernelstein. And I took this at a Comic-Con and thought that it would be really cool to build a fairly simple composite on. And the easiest way to do this is just using photo overlays and starting to build up some atmosphere, maybe making that lightsaber glow and pop. And so today we're just going to use this as an example for our discussion. Now, whenever I'm starting off with photo overlays, hands down, one of the biggest things that I do is actually go in and just cut my subject out from the background here. And what this allows me to do is really set up my file to where I can have a background of atmosphere. I can have the midground here, which is right where my subject will be sitting, and then I can have a foreground layer that's over everything else. And this is going to be a really good way to start building this up. So as I'm starting to get into my scene and starting to prep things, this background is going to get extremely distracting right away. And so the first thing that I'm going to do is head down to my adjustment layers, and we can throw a solid color adjustment layer in here. And for this, what we're going to do is just maybe make this a little bit more of, say, like a dark gray with some type of bluish background. We'll just go ahead and click OK here. We could make this, actually, let's go ahead and just make this a black background for now. So from this point, this is going to be the image that we're going to start building our atmosphere around. We know that we're going to place a background smoke in here, and so what we can do is actually create a couple groups that are going to help us out here along the way. So we'll head down and create a new group, and we can just call this BG Smoke for background smoke. And we will create another group here right on top. That's going to be foreground smoke. And then maybe one on top of this that we can go ahead and just call saber. Now this will give us a good base to start to place and organize our different overlays as we start to get these in here. Now, as I said, this isn't as much of a build the entire image and make it look great as much as it is an example of various ways to use these different overlays. Now, to get started with the overlays, say we want to have a background that's building atmosphere. And what I'd normally be looking for is something like this here. And this is from the Atmos 2 pack or the Atmosphere 2 pack. And this is going to give us quite a bit of different overlays that we can use for building atmosphere. And it's quite a bit more specific strictly to the foreground, midground, and background atmosphere. Whereas the Atmos 1 pack here is going to be very much the same. This is just a bit more directionally lit. So there's a lot of different ways that you can use these. Now, I often use these two packs really in conjunction with one another. But what we'll do here is we'll scroll down and we'll find a good overlay that we can use that's going to give us a good base for this entire composite. So we'll go ahead and grab this 101 here. We can place that in. Now, immediately we can see that we need to adjust and manipulate this overlay. So Control or Command T, this is going to allow us to transform this. We can scale this up to the size of our background. And now at this point, if we go ahead and hide that for a moment, we can see that our primary light source or our rim light is coming here from camera right. And so what we'll want to do is make sure that the overlays that we place in are very much the same in that general direction. So we'll go ahead and we can transform that, right click, flip horizontal, and this will be good for us. So we can go ahead and place this down in our background smoke group, and this will be right behind our subject here. Now let's go ahead and talk about blend modes. If I'm using something like smoke or fire, maybe a lightsaber, something that's a little bit more emissive or really illuminating my scene, I'm going to be using a screen blend mode here, or maybe even the linear dodge add blend mode. And this is really going to be the two primary blend modes that I'm going to be working with. Now, the linear dodge, as you start to get to stacking various overlays or stacking this over your subject, you're going to start getting a little bit more of a hot or say clipped output than you would with the screen blend mode. And so most cases I usually just leave it on screen and then I'll build up from there. So for the background here, let's go ahead and grab a couple different overlays. Maybe we can do this one here from Atmos 2. We can throw that in, Controller Command T for transform, and then we can just rotate this, we'll say 90 degrees clockwise, and scale this up to the size of our image here. Go ahead and commit that change, and then we can set this to screen. So what this is going to do is allow us to start building up the atmosphere here. So again, this is going to be the screen blend mode or the linear dodge blend mode here. Now the same thing goes with fire. So if we were to head down to say one of the flame kits and we wanted to throw fire into this image, we can go ahead and place this in, and we can set that to a screen blend mode. And you can see how this is working here as we start to move this overlay throughout the smoke. We can still see some of the smoke behind it, gives us a good base. Now, if we were to go ahead here and let's try the linear add or the linear dodge add blend mode, you can see here how this is starting to get quite a bit blown out. And this is the difference here between the screen blend mode and, holy cow, Photoshop, there we go, between the screen blend mode and what is this linear dodge. So if we head to screen, you can see it's a little bit more controlled. It's not really going to get so hot here in pixels. But this is going to be a really good base. So as you start to stack effects, usually for me in the type of work that I'm doing in most cases, it's going to be really layering up with the screen blend mode. Now, let's consider this background here done for now. And what we'll do is we'll start to find some foreground smoke. And so we can head in here and maybe check out the Atmos 1 pack, grab a couple overlays here that might work out well for us. I think if we go ahead and use something like this, maybe have this one down towards the bottom side, this is going to be a little bit more of a blurred or have a depth of field applied to it. Now, while we're on the topic of blend modes, we've talked about screen and we've talked about linear dodge, but what I do want to talk about is a process that's a little bit different, because those are really for more of the translucent, you can see through it types of smoke, and that might not always be the specific outcome that we want. So in this case here, let's go ahead and see if we can find an image that's going to work for us quite well that we can use as a bit more of an opaque smoke. And so I'm just browsing here through the Atmos 2 pack. There's quite a bit of heavy smoke in this one, and I think this will give us a good base. So we can possibly try a couple different overlays here. And this is one of the things that I love about using photo overlays, is that you can just drag them and drop them and adjust your image and see how you like different looks. And it works out quite well. So let's go ahead and flip this one over here. And what we'll do is we'll just make this one the entire size of our image. Go ahead and commit that change. Now let's go ahead and take a look at our screen blend mode here, or we can go ahead and take a look at our linear dodge. And you can see now that this is getting really blown out over here on the right side, whereas if we use screen, we can still see through the smoke, we can see the silhouette of our subject here, but that's not always what we want. Sometimes we want an opaque. So while we're on the discussion of blend modes and how to blend these different smokes together, let's go ahead and set this back to normal. Now we're going to be using blend if, which is actually one of your layer style or blending options for this. So what we'll do is go ahead and double click this smoke layer. Now our layer style dialog box is going to pop up. We'll see that we have the blending options here selected by default. And what we're going to be taking a look at is the blend if options down here on the bottom. Now your underlying layer, we'll start with this one and explain what that is. What this is going to be doing is removing, if we go ahead and grab our black point here, this is going to remove this photo overlay from the black points of the underlying pixels from this overlay. Same thing with the white. If we go and remove this from the white point, we'll see that we're starting to remove this from all of the white or the brightest underlying pixels. That's not exactly what we want here. We want to take this photo overlay using this layer and start to remove some of these darker values. So now we can see here that we're getting a pretty nice effect. The only problem is that it gets quite crunchy as we start to move this black point over far enough. And so what we'll do is start to remove some of the darker values in this image here. And then we can go ahead and press Alt or Option, click this handle, and then we can break and create a bit more of a threshold here between these two different values, or this threshold, the base between these two values. And this is going to work out quite well for us because now we can start to feather this effect off. So if we go ahead here now and click OK, we can see the difference between using this overlay on normal mode than if we were to go to screen mode here, and we can still see our subject through this overlay. So heading into normal, working with the layer styles blending options is going to be a really good base here for quickly adding a lot of depth, because now we can still see some of the base of our Jedi, and that's coming from this underlying layer here, the Atmos 1-pack layer that we placed in. And then using this one on top as more of an opaque smoke works out really well. Now, the best part is that as we start to build some of these layers up on top of one another, we can always manipulate these and give these quite a bit more movement. And so we're going to start talking about this here in a slightly later part of the video, but just know that there's always a way that you can go back and you can start to really manipulate a lot of these looks that you're starting to get with overlays. Now, with this one here, just for the sake of this tutorial or example, I'm just going to drop the opacity on this just a little bit here, and just allow us to see part of that silhouette here through the smoke without really showing the entire amount of detail that's happening on our subject. And then I'm also going to use a levels on this, so Control or Command L. And now we can start to really manipulate the way that the brightness of this overlay is working. Now, as we start to adjust this, you can see that some of those blend if option adjustments that we made are starting to take effect because we're adjusting the way that that threshold is working now with the pixels in the image. But what we're going to do is just slightly make it a little bit darker than it was prior. Go ahead and click OK. So you can still use your levels adjustments and your layer styles blending options together. Now, in most cases, I'll usually get my levels set first to where I'd like them, and then I'll use my adjustments to the layer styles on top of that. Whatever way you do it, just know that one affects the other as you start to make your way through it. All right, now we've got the layer styles or the blending options. We got the blend modes out of the way. Let's go ahead and talk about some of the problems that you can run into now and then when you're starting to use overlays like these. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and I'm just going to hide this layer here. You can see this, it's quite a bit apparent on this underlying layer. Now this is a fairly subtle example, but this is a good example nonetheless, because there are times where I'm starting to work on composites and it may be after the fact I start to see these tiny little lines that I may have missed as I was starting to work on building the atmosphere and building up different effects in my scene. And it has to do with these harsh lines that you start to get. And this is just from the values of this overlay. If we go ahead and set this to normal, you see that we have some of these gray values out towards the edge, and these are bits that we're definitely going to want to take care of. Now we'll go ahead and set that back down to screen. Now the easiest way to take care of these is really going to be using the layer masks first. So let's go ahead and we can create a new layer mask on this. Using a black brush, I'm just using a soft round brush here, we can just go ahead and paint any of those hard edges out. Now we can see from where we painted that now we just kind of have this almost weird sort of feathered edge, and this happens as you get very slight gray types of values in your overlays. And so what we'll do in this case is just Control or Command L on this smart object, and we'll just go ahead here and we can drop the black values in this overlay, and we'll start there with just a little bit of that black point being pushed, and then we can really start to work with the midtones. And as I'm starting to adjust this, you can see those midtones start to get feathered out. So that's going to be a very easy way to blend the smart filters and the layer mask in getting rid of these hard edges. So let's go ahead and turn that other layer back on top here. And what we're going to be talking about is various ways that we can actually manipulate overlays. And we're not really talking so much about color, we'll get to that in a moment, but we're going to be talking about some of the filters that I use most often as I'm starting to build these various composites. So in this example here, we'll actually pull in a couple different overlays just in case it's a little bit more difficult to see because we're building a heavy smoke atmosphere, but we'll get the idea nonetheless. So we'll start off with the smoke and then we can move on from there. So with this first primary major overlay that we have on top here, let's go ahead and take a look at the filters that we have for this. So one of the, I guess, most popular for me is going to be the path blur. Now the path blur is going to be really nice for adding quite a bit of motion or movement to my overlays. So we have our points here, we have our handles, we can go ahead and create a nice path here. And now what we're going to see is that we have quite a bit of movement now happening with this overlay. We can go ahead and turn off the centered blur so that this is going to be a little bit more tapered as we start to work with the taper slider. And we can go in and adjust our speed. It's going to get a bit crazy there if we crank this too high, but this is definitely one way that I like to add a sense of motion or movement to my photo composites. So we can go ahead and click OK here. And now, once that blur is applied, we can also start to work with various types of blur with the rest of the smoke that we have in our scene here. So for me, I usually like to just turn off my foreground smoke if I'm going to be working on the background smoke so I can see exactly what's happening. And let's go ahead and see which one we want to work with here. Now, I think for these two pieces of smoke, we can add another one in that's going to be a little bit maybe more easy to show this example on. And we can go ahead and just grab this one here. Now this isn't really for this image, but it will give us a good example. We can bring this all the way up to the top. Make sure that we turn some of our other layers back on here just while we're showing this. And at this point, we've already talked about the path blur. It's one of my favorites. The other one is the field blur. Now the field blur is really nice because this is going to give us an idea of where we can place the blur on this image specifically as we're starting to work around. So we have these little pins here. Now, if this is going to be pushed a bit further in the background, I'll go ahead and I'll raise this little wheel, which is just giving us the blur amount here. We can place this on the left side here and just take our blur amount and raise that to something quite high. We'll say maybe 50, 60, something like that %. Now, we can also go ahead and add more of these pins here. And this is going to allow us to manipulate the amount of blur that we have in various parts of this overlay. So let's go ahead and say that this right side here was closer to our subject and we wanted this to be a bit more in focus. This is going to be very easy for us to start manipulating. So we can go ahead and place this here, maybe grab another one and place this on this side, and then another one here. And I'm just duplicating these pins by pressing Control Alt or Command Option and dragging those pins around. But what this is doing is allowing us to really start to change the way that this overlay is looking just by adjusting the faux or the fake depth that's happening here with this field blur. And so this works out pretty good for us because we can have a sense of, maybe more foreground, background, whatever type of depth of field to it. So let's go ahead and click cancel. And we'll take a look at another example, maybe using the action debris. So the action debris is pretty cool. Works good for a lot of particle stuff, dirt charges, things of that nature. Sometimes I use these specifically just to create some type of cool abstract art from. And let's see what options we have here for overlays. So a lot of these ones here down at the bottom, I use these a lot for dirt charges. So let's go ahead and grab one of these here. And we can pull this in. Now with this in place, we can head right back up to filter. And this time we'll head to the blur gallery and we can do a path blur on this. Maybe create a bit more of a sense of motion. So if you're doing something like an explosion, this is going to be a really good way to give you some nice movement. Maybe turning off the centered blur here. It's going to do a really good job of giving a sense of movement or force to these particles that we're working with. So let's go ahead and take a look at what this looks like here now. There we go, filter, blur gallery, and we can do a field blur on this. And maybe take these ones here that are towards the background and we'll decrease the blur on those. We'll do the small ones here and really increase the blur amount with these here. And so this is going to give us a really good fall off effect with a depth of field, all with just having the one overlay, so that we're not having to really go and start to stack tons of these on top of one another just to create that fake depth of field. Now, generally in my workflow, I tend to use a lot of different layers. I enjoy effects, but it may not be the look that you're going for. Now let's go ahead and grab one of these flame images here from the Flame Kit 2. And we'll start to talk about one of the ways that I actually like to manipulate fire for different effects if I'm dealing with, say, superheroes and I need some type of crazy stream of fire or anything of that nature. So we'll go ahead and just grab one of these overlays, place them in our scene. Now, what I normally like to do for these is actually head up to Edit and Puppet Warp. And I would like to really warp this image by placing various pins and really start to manipulate the way that these pins are working. The problem is that this gets a little bit crazy and it's pulling the entire image overlay as a whole. And not that this is really a huge deal in most cases, but for me, I usually like to simplify this down to the specific part of the image that I'm wanting to work with, which is just the flame. So what we'll do, we can go ahead and press Escape, and I'm going to head back into my blending options in the Layer Styles dialog box here, and I'm just going to feather the black point here, holding down Alt or Option, right on this layer, and we'll click OK. Now, if we right click, we can convert this to a smart object again. And now with this smart object, if we go ahead into our Puppet Warp, we'll see that now we can just manipulate this flame by itself. So we can place our pins and we can start to move various islands of this fire around. And this really lends itself to giving us the flexibility of warping these flames around our subject, around the arms, extremities, whatever type of effects you're wanting to work with, and we can work with each of these islands individually. Now if we go ahead and just click enter here, and now at this point here is where I would go in and I would just set this at a screen blend mode so that we can start building these different effects on top of one another. So let's go ahead and get rid of our flame here. And now we can start to talk a little bit more about color. Now, when it comes to color, there's actually a couple different ways that we can manipulate the color of overlays. Now, let's go ahead and find an image here that we can use for the lightsaber. Now, in the Saber Effects pack that we have here, there's actually quite a few different variations and options. So I'm just going to pick one here and we'll kind of run with it. So let's go ahead and place this into our scene. We can go ahead and set this to a screen blend mode, and then we'll transform this roughly into place. Rotate that around here. We can scale that in a little bit and then make this quite a bit wider, just so that we can somewhat fit this lightsaber here. Now, in most cases for stuff like this, I'm actually going to head right into this and paint out the old lightsaber so that we're not trying to really stack this on top of an existing effect. But nonetheless, it's an example. We can do what we want here and make it work. So from this point, there are plenty of ways that we can manipulate the color of this lightsaber. And this is really easy, just using Controller Command U on this smart filter. It's going to bring up our hue and saturation. Now we can go ahead here and maybe even choose colorize and start to really choose and fine tune the specific color that we want to use here. Now this is really an easy way to go about it. So if we go ahead and click OK, we have our smart filter. Easiest thing about smart filters is we can always double click those and start to make further adjustments to the color of this saber if we really wanted to. Now what we'll do, go ahead and just click cancel on this one. Now the next part of this is really heading down to our adjustment layers, and we can add a hue saturation adjustment layer. This could easily be done if we wanted to do something maybe like a color balance. Whatever type of color adjustment layers you want to use, you can use for this. But in this instance, we'll use the hue saturation again, and we can hold down Alt or Option, hover right between these two layers, and then just make a clipping mask for this hue saturation layer to affect only the lightsaber layer that's underneath it. Now, if we were to go ahead here and adjust using our properties, and we adjust the colors that we have here, we can really pick whatever we want. Again, very similar to the last options that we had. So we'll kind of head down to the other end of the spectrum here, and we can maybe just click colorize and make this a little bit more of an orange red rather than a magenta red. So now we have our red saber here on that side, and this is going to work out well for us. These are two different ways to add to just a single overlay, which isn't really so bad. It gets quite easy at this point, but we might actually want to go in and adjust more than one layer at once. So remember all the way in the beginning when we were talking about the background smoke, let's hide all of our different effects here, and we'll focus just on the background. Now, what we can do here is go ahead, Controller Command U, colorize this, add say a blue color. We can make that a little bit more cyan, desaturate this maybe a little bit, click OK. Now we have our smart filter. Control Alt or Command Option, we could drag this smart filter down to another layer that's underneath it. This can get very cumbersome if we're doing this on multiple layers at once. So in this case, let's go ahead and clear our smart filters here from both of these. Now the cool part about blend modes is that you actually have the ability to change your groups from pass through here to any of the blend modes that you may be wanting to use. So in our case, we're going to change this to a screen blend mode, which would there change all of our layers inside to screen. The cool part about this now is that if we head down and we grab something like the hue saturation and place that in our background smoke layer, come on Photoshop, there we go. Not sure exactly what happened here. So with this hue saturation now on top of these other two layers that we have inside of our group with the group's blend mode set to screen, this is going to allow us now to colorize our entire background smoke for everything that we have in the back here. Now this also works for our foreground smoke. Go ahead and turn that on. Now we've got two different overlays here. Let's go ahead and grab a third so we can head into our packs here, and we'll head back to Atmos 2, and we'll go ahead and just scroll down and find another overlay that we can place in here. This will help us see this effect a little bit better here just on the foreground. Go ahead, we'll place that in, and we can set this to a screen blend mode. Now, if we go ahead and we set the entire group to screen, we'll see that now all of our different layers have gone to screen, so we don't have our opaque smoke anymore. And that's not really something that we want at this point. We still want to have that opaque smoke. So what I'm going to do is actually take that smoke out of this group. And then for all of the smoke elements that we have inside the group that we want to be affected, we can go ahead and Control Alt or Command Option, and we can just duplicate this hue saturation layer up on top of this smoke. So now we're starting to get that same color here in the foreground. We could also go ahead and change this color for the foreground smoke. Maybe make this something a little bit less saturated. And then now, since we have just this one layer here that's outlying, we can bring that up and then create a clipping mask for just that one piece of foreground smoke. And what this does is really allows us to keep away from adding a ton of different smart filters. It keeps us down to maybe one or just a couple different hue saturation adjustment layers as we're starting to work our way through this, but it allows us to go in and start to really control the color of everything that we have, or all of the overlays that we have in our environment. So for this one here, we'll go with maybe a deeper blue for the background. In the foreground, we could change this to something a little bit maybe more crazy. We could find a nice magenta in here somewhere, pump the saturation up, and then duplicate this up to the top one here. And there we go, get rid of that, and then create our clipping mask. So now we have a magenta pink foreground, blue background, cool looking Jedi with his lightsaber, and we could start to really go in and build all of these different effects just using these overlays. Again, as you start to get into these overlays, you can see that we have some of these crazy looking lines that are being left over. And here again, this is just a layer mask with a black brush, and we can just paint some of the effects out of these various overlays. I think this was actually the one underneath here. There we go. Select the layer mask, and then we can paint out any of these harsh lines that we have in our comp. So as you can see, this is a really easy way to start building up the look and depth and color of our images using overlays, and it all happens fairly quickly. All right, now at this point, let's go ahead and reset some of this stuff to a little bit more of what might be a realistic state that I would work in here. So I'm just going to duplicate some of these layers around, delete some of these others, and get this back to maybe a slightly less saturated version than what it currently was. All right. Now, the next part of this video is really more talking about some of the things that I do often as I'm starting to work with various overlays and composite effects. Now, in this example, what we'll do is we'll just make a couple small adjustments, like moving this foreground smoke down a little bit here. And we'll start talking about the effects that different elements would have in our scene. And so this is a really good point at which we can talk about organizing your file. And in this case here, we've got a pretty decent organization. We'll just go ahead and call this background adjustment layer here. Background, we have our background smoke, subject, foreground smoke, and then this is just our smoke that is not on a screen layer. So we'll just call it smoke NS for not screen. I'll probably forget that later. Usually I get crazy with naming conventions and it gets all cluttered and I organize it later. Now, as we're starting to get into adding various different lighting effects specifically, so things like this lightsaber, we want to start taking into account the way that that lightsaber is going to be affecting the rest of our scene or our environment. So here in this case, what we're going to do is actually use the levels, Control or Command L, and we're going to make this just a little bit brighter here and then crunch the black point just a little bit. And we can see that this one here isn't perfectly aligned. It's kind of hanging over the edge, and I'll just point it out here a minute if I can get scrubby zoom to work. There we go. It's hanging over the edge a little bit. That's not really a problem. But what we're going to be doing is actually painting various colors around on some of this smoke so that it looks like it makes sense to be in this space, because it would be starting to work with and scattering light throughout this smoke. So what I normally like to do at this point is head right down, maybe underneath the overlay layer, which in this case is the saber, and I'm going to create just a blank layer here. We can grab our brush tool and maybe use a lower flow. We can set this layer here to overlay, use Alter Option, select one of the colors here that we have in the element that we're working with, and we'll do a fire example here in a moment so that we can show you what that would look like. And now I'm just going to slightly build up some of this effect in the smoke and the background elements that we're using. Now this is a really rough example, but this is going to give you a little bit more of an idea of how you can start to bring some of these different effects together. And I'm going to start selecting various parts of this that are a little bit brighter than one another and start to paint some of this into the smoke. Now, as we're starting to work with this, we can still go ahead and use our blend if options on this layer. So we can double click the layer here, give that a moment to pop up, and then we can start to remove this from some of those darker areas in our scene. Same thing is with some of the brighter areas in our scene, and this is going to allow us to really start to blend some of those effects in. Okay, so that's one way. Painting that by hand is going to work out pretty well for us. Now let's go ahead and grab one of the flames here, and we'll pull that into our comp. Now the flames in this sense aren't really going to make a huge impact because this is more smoky atmosphere. But if we go ahead and we set this to screen and maybe bring this up towards the top of our scene here, one of the things that we're going to want to consider is the color that we're implementing into our scene. So if our fire is behind our subject, and say for example we create a new layer and we select one of these fire colors, set this layer to overlay, and we start to paint a little bit more light from this fire, impacting some of the smoke around it as the light would scatter through that. We can go through various colors here and start to get some really nice buildup of different values here. Maybe even head in with something a little bit more deep and saturated. a little bit more red here. There we go. And we start to build this into the rest of our environment. Hey, cool, we have some nice looking fire here in the background. But this isn't really going to make sense with our subject because our subject doesn't have that same color on them. So if we go ahead and we bring this here towards the background, so we'll just say underneath our subject, it's going to get a little bit, let's go up here. It's going to be a little bit different for us because we have our one smoke overlay in there. So what we'll do is we'll just bring our subject up more towards the foreground. And this is just going to show the example of what this is going to look like as we start to work and build up these effects behind our subject. So now in this case, if we go ahead and we zoom in just a little ways here, we'll see that we have a blue rim light here on our subject where our fire is a bit more orange. And this is going to always create some kind of weird balance between your eyes visually seeing that this fire is fake because we know that it would actually be casting a color. So one of the ways that I actually like to adjust this is just by painting some quick light on our subject and making these type of adjustments as I'm starting to build up the various levels of the composite. Now in this case, we can head into our adjustment layers. We'll just grab a hue and saturation. And what we'll do here is go to colorize, make this a little bit more fiery looking. And this is just one way to do it here. And once this is done, we can go ahead and check out our different blend modes. So we could set this to overlay, we could set this to soft light. We could go ahead and leave this on normal and then use our blend if. So double click to get into our layer style dialog and then use our blend if options to start pulling this right out of some of the shadow areas. Finding a decent balance here. Go ahead and click OK. We can put this layer right on top of our subject here. Alter option, hover right between those two layers, create a clipping mask, and then now we can see that this is really taking effect directly over the entire image of our subject. That's not really what we want. So instead of this white layer mask, we can go ahead and Control or Command I with the layer mask selected, invert that, and now we can go ahead with a white brush. We'll just take our flow and increase that all the way, and then we can just go ahead and now paint this right on top of our subject, just in those areas that we want to be affected here. And this is really going to work well with starting to sell some of the color that we have in the background. And this is going to give us a really quick and easy result here with matching the same type of light that we're getting with the rest of our scene. So we can go ahead here and now with our layer style or our blend if options in place, with our layer mask in place, and now we can go ahead and start to adjust some of these different blend modes to something maybe like color, what have you, that are going to help this work out a little bit better. Now, this is just a very quick and dirty way to go about matching the light color from our background that we're starting to build with these composites as we start to layer these effects up. Alright, so that's going to wrap up today's video on how to get started using photo overlays. Now, the overlays that we're using here, the Pro EDU compositing overlays, are things from my personal library that I use in a lot of my work, and there's a very wide range of effects that you can use. So I'm sure that you're going to find something that will fit your specific workflow or your need for your library as you start to move forward. Now, we've talked a lot about the ways that we can manipulate the color of overlays, ways that we can manipulate them with effects and add movement and things that are going to make our images a little bit more dynamic. Now, I'm really excited to see how you as an artist start to use and manipulate all of these overlays to fit your work. Now, as always, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Never stop learning. I'll see you in the next video.